Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome everybody to this short introduction to al-Barahin, the mother of proofs. This is one of the great classics within the Islamic literary tradition, in particular with regards to theology or al-Kalam, philosophical theology. This is really important. Imam Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Sanusi was a great scholar from Tilmisan, from Algeria, North Africa. Yet his text really does spread all over the Muslim world, cherished, memorized, studied by so many people throughout the ages and until this very day. It's still a book that is really a household name for those that are interested in Islamic theology. The reason for that is because As-Sanusi was a great writer. That's the truth of the matter. Yes, he was a polymath scholar. He was brilliant in so many different areas, but he was a marvelous writer. He writes these five really important books in the field of Islamic theology. He writes the Muqaddimat, which are really these preliminary discussions, a discussion on terminology within Ilm al-Kalam, so that the beginning student gets used to it. Then he has his Al-Kharida, or known also as Sughra Asura, which is the minor treatise of the minor treatise of the minor treatise. And this is really, as he says himself in the text, designed for children. And of course, adults can study it, those that are beginning their journey in Ilm al-Kalam. But he wrote it essentially as a way for children to memorize. Very, very short text indeed. This text, al-Barahin, is the third in that line. The reason why we've chosen it, what we've chosen this particular text at Open Madrasa to begin our journey in Asharite Kalam is because this is al-Barahin. The proof is sort of in the title, which is this is the text in which he brings in rational proofs. So that's very important for us because we're going to study creed, but not in a way that we're just going to accept it and take it for granted. But we want to begin our journey in Ilm al-Kalam with adilla, with proofs. We want to know why this is the case that we as Muslims believe X or Y. We want rational proofs. Rational proofs meaning we want something which is mutual, something that I can agree on, you can agree on. It doesn't matter where we're coming from, what religious tradition or the lack thereof that we are coming from, but we can all appreciate rational proofs. Reason is something that we all, of course, must agree upon. So al-Barahin is the beginning of that journey. Then he has his Al-Wusta, which is the middle treatise. Of course, al-Barahin is also called his As-Sughra, which is the minor or the smaller or the shorter treatise. Then we have Al-Wusta, which is the middle, and then we have Al-Kubra, which is the major treatise that he writes in Ilm al-Kalam. And thankfully for us, the author himself comments on all of these books. He has commentaries on all of these books, really making it easier for us to understand exactly what he meant. Famously, the Arabs would say, Sahibul Bayt adra bima fi baytihi, that the one who owns the house surely knows best what is in the house. So what we want to do in this, what hopefully will be a short video, is to introduce a little bit about the author himself and about the text, its structure, and why it is important. So let's move on to that quickly. So Imam Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Sanusi from Tilmisan, Algeria, North Africa, a very, very famous polymath scholar, authors this wonderful text amongst these five texts that I mentioned, but it's designed to be a foundational text. It's the place in which you can open your eyes into the world of Kalam. So that's very important. Now, As-Sanusi, like every other Ash'ari, essentially from his period, and really from before his period, he really is, and again, this is for those that perhaps have read a little bit more into Islamic theology and its history, you will know that there were in the classical period two broad strands of Kalam within the Asharite school. You have a Jawanian strand, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we actually get into the text, and we'll highlight some of these nuances. But Imam al-Jawani, famously the teacher of the great Al-Imam al-Ghazali, he was a prolific writer himself in multiple fields, but also in Kalam. So the North African tradition of As-Sanusi really is following in his line. It's a very classical Ash'ariyism, meaning it's an Ash'ariyism that holds firm to classical theology of the early Asharite scholars, without allowing any strong influence from hikmah or philosophy or of the falasifa, the philosophers of Islam, such as Avicenna, al-Farabi, al-Kindi, Averroes ibn Rushd, and many others, and even to some degree, some of those from the Sufis that are also philosophers. They did not like too much of that philosophy. They wanted rational argumentation based upon the principles set out by Sheikh al-Ash'ari himself, the founder of the school, but they did not like there to be huge amounts of philosophical discussion occupying their texts. This happened not just in Ilm al-Kalam, but this also happened in Usul al-Fiqh. Likewise, we have Usul al-Fiqh, and likewise we have Ilm al-Mantiq, logic. In these three subjects, there were some scholars that were very philosophical, even if they were Ash'ari, but they were very philosophical. They brought a lot from the hukama, meaning the philosophers, such as Avicenna, and there were those that warned against those texts, even from the same school. And the other strand, so you have the Jawanian strand and you have the Razian strand. By the time you get to Imam Razi was very keen on opening up those gates to philosophy, remaining true within a Ash'arite paradigm, but allowing the door to open to philosophy. Now, so typical of that period and that strand of Ash'ariism, they were still very much interested in responding to these three groups. Now, I must say, this is not to say that all of the Ash'aris were not doing this, they all were. But al-Sanusi is very, very proud of his heritage as being a very traditionalist Ash'ari. And so in that regard, they are essentially responding in this theology to three main groups. The first being the philosophers, known as the Hukama Islamiyun, or the Falasifa. And so they argued that the universe was eternal. Now, of course, I'm oversimplifying this. What they meant by the universe did not necessarily mean that which is material. So they have a slightly different conception of what is included in that term, al-alam, or universe, and that's a technical discussion that we will have to get into when we're actually reading the text, inshallah. So, but the argument is with no beginning, and so no need for a creator. So this is the argument, at least how al-Sanusi sees it, and he is going to be responding to it. Likewise, al-Mu'tazila claimed unaided reason alone could bind God to a fixed standard of best. They were moralists. For them, it was very important to suggest that morality is not only known through the intellect, but also dictated by the intellect, such that even God is bound to those dictates. So even if there's no revelation, it's still true that God must and is bound to the moral the moral code, such as punishing the disobedient and rewarding the obedient. That there is absolute inconceivability that God will not do that, that he must do that. It's not to say that he will do that because he's promised that, which is the Asharite perspective, but for the Mu'tazila, it's that he must do that. So now there's a rational dictate of morality that is even binding God. This was something completely unacceptable to Asharite theologians, and for that reason, they had to respond to this to suggest that no, and they had to argue for their version of divine command theory. Thirdly, you had the literalists, the Hashawiyya, the Mujassima. These are people that read scripture and its every word about God at face value, edging at times towards describing him as a body. They would take literally what God has said and not metaphorically, not reading the Quran at times as being as utilizing metaphor and simile and all of these wonderful aspects of language that allow it to be eloquent, but they were reading it literally. Now, they may have been doing that with absolute sincerity, of course, but the lazim, the consequence essentially of that, the necessary consequence or conclusion of that could entail tanseem, which is to to make essentially God like a body. So these were three broad schools that the Sunni Ash'ari tradition was responding to. Now, the author himself, Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Sanusi, was a Maliki jurist, Ash'ari theologian, and Sufi scholar. And beyond theology, a writer on Quranic exegesis, hadith, Arabic grammar, logic, medicine, and astronomy. As I say, he truly was a polymath. 1428 to 1490 is his lifespan, common era. And he is from Tilmisan in Algeria. And of course, as we say, he was a Maliki of Madhab. Now, Ahmad al-Suhaimi famously said, "There is nothing comparable on the earth to his work in knowing Allah by sound proofs on the basis of the Sunnah and Quran." Now, I talked already in my preliminary discussion a little bit about these books. So we talked about his Muqaddimat, then his Al-Kharida or Sughra Al-Sughra, then we have his, Sughra Al-Sughra, then we have his Al-Aqidah Al-Sughra, his Al-Aqidah Al-Wusta, and his Al-Kubra. So the name is a claim about method. Sanusi doesn't ask students to memorize conclusions. He teaches them to generate Burhan, which are proofs, a reusable engine of reasoning that can be pointed at almost any theological question. This is the point of why we are reading al-Barahin. The idea is now he's going to begin introducing his rational argument. So for example, Allah Ta'ala is one. Now, it's necessary for Allah to be one. This is going to be from his negative attributes, salbiya. There's a categorization that Ash'aris use for the attributes of God, which we'll talk about in the lesson or in the lessons. But one of them is wahdaniyya, that God is one in his essence, one in his attributes, one in his actions, etc. But what does oneness mean? Of course, this is a huge, probably one of the greatest philosophical discussions in the history of humanity, but for sure of Islam, because the entire idea of God and the necessary existent being is all dependent upon this concept of oneness. What does it truly mean? What does it mean for God to have existence and for us, for example, to have existence? This has occupied the minds of Sufis, philosophers, theologians, intellectuals for thousands of years, truly. In any case, but as I say, the wonderful thing about the text is the text teaches you a method of argumentation and reasoning through your creed. That makes it very unique. For example, every rational judgment sorted into three boxes. Everything, for example, is going to be either a wajib, a necessary, or a mustahil, an inconceivable impossibility, or a jaiz, a possible. For example, it's necessary that the universe has a cause. Nothing can come from nothing, truly. There's no way in our mind that we cannot see causality or no causality through the universe, meaning the cause of the universe. Mustahil, and of course, this is an introduction. The whole point of the course is really about establishing that wajib. Mustahil, like a square circle, for example. You cannot imagine a square circle. You can conceptualize about it, but you cannot imagine it. It's mustahil aqlan, right? Likewise, jaiz, something which is possible. My twin brother, for example. My twin brother is possible. He could have or not existed. God chose for him to not exist. Therefore, I have no twin brother. But it's possible in the mind. A unicorn existing is possible in the mind, even if not even a single instance of it exists within extra-mental reality. So every claim in the book about God, his attributes, the universe, the prophets, is sorted into these three categories. Even prophets, what is necessary for prophets? What is impossible for prophets? So for example, necessary for prophets is telling the truth. Impossible for prophets is lying. What's possible for them? Eating food. Eating food, because prophets are humans. It's possible for them to eat food. But what's not possible for them is lying or hiding the message or being unintelligent or deception. These are all impossible for prophets. And of course, the text goes about to prove all of those things. Likewise, from his proof engine is from a moving body to an uncaused creator. So this is where he will begin speaking about the reality of a creator and establishing that reality through cosmology by studying the universe. That if we look at the universe, bodies are constantly shifting between motion and rest, haraka and sakun. What is eternal cannot change, so motion and rest are temporally originated. Bodies can't exist apart from motion or rest, so the whole universe is temporally originated. Everything is in motion or rest, and these are essentially accidents. They're properties. Properties are fleeting, and you cannot have substance without them. And if substance cannot be without something which is fleeting or temporal, then that substance is dependent upon something, and therefore itself is contingent. Meaning, if substance is contingent upon a property and a property is contingent upon the substance, this mutual dependency that they have means that both of them are contingent. As an example, these are some of the examples where they are going to use cosmology to be able to establish. I mean, somebody may say, well, can't you just say that there was now the Big Bang? Because although, of course, science can never be certain absolutely about something, but it seems to be the agreement of scientists that happened. Yes, but al-Sanusi is highlighting something very, very subtle, because it doesn't matter what that cosmology is now, essentially. Because if you can establish the contingency of the universe, it doesn't matter whether it's atoms and accidents any longer, or whether it's something else that makes up the universe, some other substance, for example, or whether it's a simulation, right? This is some big program. It doesn't really matter what you put in there, because ultimately the conclusion is the same, that all of it's contingent. Whatever it is contingent. And that means that there must be a non-contingent, meaning a necessary being that caused it. So regardless of what the cosmology is, of course, as Asharite theologians, they would always argue for atoms and accident, because that is the major philosophical cosmology, you could say, for the theologians, because a lot of that are based upon their metaphysical assumptions as opposed to their observations. And we'll talk more about that in the lessons too, of how they came to their conclusions. What is the context? What were they thinking? That's really what makes all of this stuff quite interesting. And in any case, the idea is that if you don't affirm that cause, then there will be an infinite regress of causes, and subsequently the world shouldn't have been here, but it is here. It is here. And so we learn from the mashhud, we learn from what is observed, we learn from cosmology, we learn from the ontological status of contingency of the universe, that there must be an uncaused cause, a necessary cause that is not dependent or contingent upon the preponderance, the tarjih of something else, and that is the wajib al-wujud. So it's a very coherent worldview in order to get to that final goal. Likewise, could there be two gods? I opened up by talking about, like, for example, oneness. I'm not going to go into this slide, but this is where he will bring in these two major evidences called Burhan at-Tawarud and at-Tamanu'. And these are wonderful arguments to highlight the fact that it's inconceivable that there could be two causes for whole causes, complete causes for one effect. And what would happen if two quote unquote gods would have to share power? What would that mean? In every situation, it would fail, right? Whether they agree to share it, then it's a possibility that there could be a conflict, which is basically to say that it's possible for there to be a square circle. So that's absurd. Put that to a side. Okay, they don't just agree to disagree, or agree to agree, rather, but they're compelled to. So who's compelling them? So is there a bigger God and they're just demigods? So that's absurd. That falls apart. Or maybe they just share. Well, if they share, then do they have complete dominion? Well, of course they don't. So that's absurd. Or perhaps one acts and the other one acts over that. Well, that's what they call tahsil al-hasil, which is absurd, which is the idea that something's already been achieved. How can you achieve it again? If I've already pushed the button of the lift, it doesn't matter how many times you push it, I've already pushed it and the effect has been achieved. What you're doing is now abath, it's futile, it's folly, it's useless. And so can God and his act be useless? So that's absurd. So in all of those four circumstances, whichever way you look at it, the conclusion is going to be upset. Therefore, there can only be one God, etc. This is how he's going to build up the argument. Likewise, the 20 necessary attributes. This is a big critique that people sometimes have of the Ash'aris, that God has an infinite amount of names and attributes. And how can you say only 20? What's meant by here are ummahat. Ummahat. These are major attributes beneath which all of the attributes are going to come. For example, God's what they call ma'ani sifat, or entitative attributes. And again, all of this is going to be discussed in our lessons. The idea of, let's say, God's qudra, his power. But when his power manifests in the form of giving, let's say, sustenance, then he is a raziq. He's the sustainer. When it's in the form of giving life, he's muhyi. When it's in the form of him taking life, it's mumit. When it's in the form of him showing mercy, it's rahim. Meaning that all of those attributes that you know are all displays, perspectives of his sifa of al-qudra. So these are four main categories that al-Sanusi makes for these attributes. You have the nafsi attribute, the nafsiyya, which is existence, and we'll talk why that means, why is that his essential attribute. Likewise, the negating attributes, the salbiyya, which is qidam, baqa, mukhalif lil hawadith, al-qa'im bin nafs, and al-wahdaniyya, pre-eternality, everlastingness, unlikeness to creation, self-subsisting, oneness. And likewise, you have his ma'ani. Why they call ma'ani? All of that's going to come in the lesson. These are the entitative or attributes of meaning. And these are ilm, knowledge, irada, will, qudra, power, sama, hearing, basar, seeing, and kalam, which is speech. And of course, if you are a Hanafi or a Maturidi, they would normally add on the seventh, the additional attribute of takween, which is to bring into being. Likewise, the derived statuses or attributes, well, if God has power, he is powerful. If he has knowledge, he is knowing. If he has will, volition, then he is willing. If he has sight and hearing, then he is seeing and hearing. And if he has speech, then he is speaking. So these are all derived from those attributes in terms of how we understand them, meaning in terms of they are perspectives, active perspectives of those attributes. So we'll talk more about that in the lessons as well. Likewise, each one of these has an opposite. If he's all powerful, that means he cannot be unable. If he is all knowing, that means he cannot be ignorant, etc. Likewise, for prophets, as I mentioned earlier, so truthfulness, trustworthiness, conveying the message, these are all necessary for prophets. There's no way in which a prophet cannot do this. Likewise, what's impossible for them? Lying, treachery, concealing revelation, and dullness. Likewise, what's possible for them? Ordinary human contingencies, illness, hunger, forgetfulness in worldly matters. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Somebody may say, that sounds a bit strange, and indeed it does, because even some of the ulama, the scholars, they mention that even their forgetfulness was actually a way in which God was teaching us through them how to deal with situations in which we forget. Some people, of course, think that this is being extreme and saying, well, they have a human aspect to them in normal worldly things. There's no big discussion on that. This has been a debate historically amongst the Ash'aris too, and that will come up and we can talk a little bit about that. And how many scholars actually defended that, which is to say that actually even their forgetfulness, even in the most, what we would consider to be trivial things, there was always in that a wisdom. There was always in that a wisdom. So we could talk about that, we can discuss all of those things. So anything that does not compromise their integrity and the job that they are doing, all of that would be possible for them. Now, and then he deals with 6 roots of disbelief. Not everything that he's saying here is actual disbelief, and we'll talk about what that means. There are distinctions of disbelief. For example, you have disbelief according to the theologians and disbelief according to the jurists. They're slightly different, and we'll talk about that. And this is not exactly, and not everything here is agreed upon, or there are some nuances and discussion within each aspect. I mean, we're dealing with a 1,000-year-old giant theological, philosophical tradition. So there's definitely going to be a dispute and debate therein. For example, intrinsic necessity, that creation flows from God's essence by necessity, not will, which is the position of the philosophers, was considered kufr. by al-Sanusi and many of the Asharis. Likewise, rational deeming, so unaided reason alone judges good and evil. So there's some nuance and oversimplification there, but we'll talk about what al-Sanusi means. Blind imitation, again, a very strong position he holds on this, which is that somebody believes from tribal habit without examination, hence why he begins his text with يَجِبُ عَلَى كُلِّ مُكَلَّفٍ, that it's necessary, it's obligatory upon every single legally, morally obliged believer that they must know this creed. And there's a lot of nuance to that. The iman of the muqallid, the iman of the blind imitator, is a matter of dispute. And we'll talk about that. What is that dispute? Habitual association, an intrinsic link assumed between cause and effect. We'll talk about that and Imam al-Ghazali's historic role in that. That till this day is very much critiqued by Western Orientalists. However, that's now becoming more and more debunked as it becomes clearer what exactly al-Ghazali was speaking to. So there's a huge historical and a meeting of two civilizations in the Western Academy when it comes to that particular issue, and we'll talk about that there. Likewise, compound ignorance, being wrong while certain one is right. Rigid literalism, again, a huge discussion, and that's going to occupy some of our time. Now, the text circulated, and I talked about that through the North and West Africa, Southeast Asia. There's Malay Jawi script translations of the text itself. Europe, of course, many languages it's been translated into. We can see it has countless commentaries, hugely successful in terms of achieving commentaries, and a single page that takes a beginner from a bare three-way distinction, necessary, impossible, to a fully reasoned case for God, his attributes of the prophets. Every later work of Ash'ari Kalam assume the scaffolding is already in place. And that's true. It doesn't matter how those Ash'ari books are structured or what they were teaching or how philosophical they may have got. The assumption was that you understand what is a wajib, a mustahil, a mumkin. You understand what is a hukm aqli, a hukm adi, what is a hukm shar'i. You understood the taqsim of the sifat. You understood what ayn means, what ghayr means. These were all assumptions by the theologians when they were writing their books. So this really is the springboard into theology. And so we're beginning with that. And we're very happy that we are going to begin with the creed of Imam al-Sanusi in order to begin our journey in Ash'ari theology throughout the subsequent 3 levels that will come after this. So the hope is that it will be 4 levels and that you will be joining us. So we thank you for joining us today. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.